Deus Ex Invisible War is not great. It's pretty mediocre overall and feels like something that should have come out before the first Deus Ex game. It's almost like a prototype for the series. In general, it's just a downgrade to most everything presented in the first entry. Now, that's not to say that it's a bad game. It has its moments. There are things that I genuinely like about it, and I think most of the appeal from the first game is still there. Invisible War tweaked a lot, though, and most of the things it did mess with worked better in the previous entry. Everyone had told me that this was the low point of the series, that out of the 4 games that Deus Ex had presented, Invisible War was the worst, and I think they were right. That being said, if this was the worst that the series could offer, then the series' lows are something to be envied. Invisible War didn't succeed in my eyes. It was a devolution for the series, a step backwards. But there's still some things worth talking about here. The general appeal and freedom of gameplay is still here. There's just less incentive to play different ways. Today, we're going to take a look at Deus Ex Invisible War. I'll be talking about gameplay, story, mechanics, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous video on Deus Ex, you should probably go watch that now, as it provides context for where the story and series end up in this entry. If you like the video and want to support the channel, you can do so for free by liking the video and subscribing, as it really helps me out. You can also subscribe to the Patreon, where I upload longer versions of my full retrospectives and long rambling text post updates from time to time. You can also follow me on Twitch, where I play games that I'm not currently reviewing. Spoiler alert for everything Deus Ex Invisible War, and the original Deus Ex. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Deus Ex Invisible War. Before we get into the video, I'd like to talk about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a high-quality meal delivery service that gives you ready-to-cook food right to your doorstep. Not only are they incredibly convenient, making them time-effective, but they also save you money. With over 40 weekly recipes, the variety is there as well, and these different meal plans can keep you on track for those New Year's goals. I'm not the best cook in the world. I'm actually more of a baking kind of guy. But I do think cooking can actually be really fun, and I think HelloFresh makes it a good experience. Their meals are easy to cook and prepare, meaning even someone like me can make something that looks like this. Okay, I may have not made the meal live up to the picture, but that doesn't mean that the flavor wasn't there, because this thing was delicious. If you want to have this same experience, go to HelloFresh.com and use code FavoriteSon65 to get 65% off plus free shipping today. That's HelloFresh.com using code FavoriteSon65 to get 65% off plus free shipping. Now back to the video, Dad. Deus Ex Invisible War began development shortly after Deus Ex was released. It was again developed by Ion Storm and published by Eidos Interactive. Some pretty important staff changes were made this time around. The largest was that Warren Spector was no longer directing. Deus Ex was the game of his dreams, and he got the massive opportunity to make that game. He wanted to give that opportunity to someone else, Harvey Smith, the lead designer from the first Deus Ex. Spector had also just invested a lot into the previous game and wanted to take more of a back seat on this entry. At the time, Ion Storm had also been developing the third Thief game, after Looking Glass Studios had shut down. This left Spector having a supervising role for both games, rather than being really hands-on with anything. Spector described himself as the chief kibitzer for Ion Storm, a Yiddish term that means to offer advice, often unwanted. Though Spector wanted to take a back seat, it was hard for him in the beginning. He questioned many of the choices that were made, but ultimately he felt fine standing back. One of the team's big goals with this entry was to get the game into more players' hands. They needed this entry to be profitable, so they wanted to make it more accessible. Spector knew that this term was looked at as a bad thing by fans, but he didn't view it as a dumbing down, just making something more available. It's kind of ironic because a lot of the decisions that Spector was questioning during development were things I questioned about the game when I actually played it. When Spector was asked what he hoped fans took away from the game, he said this: "I hope players take away from it that we didn't sell out, just doing another game with a number after the name for profit, because we didn't. I hope they take away that, hey, these guys really paid attention to what happened in the first game, what we said about the first game, what they learned from the first game, and they refined the gameplay to a point that I can't even imagine them making it any better." It's very clear that the team wanted the game to make money, but also wanted more people to play their game. At the same time, they didn't want to be viewed as sellouts or making something that wasn't worthy of the series it was a part of. To this end, they developed the sequel for Xbox as well. This drastically changed the scope, style, and design of the game. Due to the Xbox's limited processing power and RAM, this meant environments had to be sized down. There had to be some changes made, but the team wanted to improve overall. Smith specifically referenced the stealth as something the team tried to upgrade in Invisible War. The team used a heavily modified version of Unreal Engine for the development of the Deus Ex sequel. Deus Ex Invisible War was released on December 2nd, 2003 for Microsoft Windows and Xbox. A few notes before we get into things. I played Deus Ex Invisible War on PC. This was mostly because this version was easily accessible to me. It was much more of an effort to buy an original Xbox, one of the only classic consoles that I don't yet own, and a copy of Deus Ex Invisible War. I thought this was going to be much more of an issue than it actually was. Everything I had read online about Invisible War had told me that it was much more of the same when compared to the previous game. Its PC version was terribly integrated with modern hardware, and it barely worked without a ton of fixes. This wasn't exactly the case for me, though. Outside of one widescreen fix that I had to run every time I booted up the game, I encountered virtually no issues. I think I saw one crash during my entire playtime, so I got very lucky. This video is also probably going to be shorter than my other ones in the series, mostly because the game itself is shorter, and I also just didn't have a lot to say about it. If you want the quick version, the game just devolves the previous game and takes it down a level. It's not terrible, but isn't great either. Invisible War begins with a cinematic. The intro and ending cutscenes are now pre-rendered for both the PC and console versions of the game. Some people are trying to locate a terrorist who ends up using a nanite detonator to destroy the city of Chicago. At this point, we can clearly see that the style and aesthetic of the series has greatly changed. I wasn't really impressed with this intro, mostly because it's hard to really even understand what's going on. On top of that, this odd sci-fi style is much different than the espionage secrecy one that we got before. There's also a character here voiced by Tom Hall, one of the founders of id Software and Ion Storm. Tom Hall voiced Walton Simmons from Deus Ex and some other characters in the first game. Because his voice was so iconic, though, I just assumed the whole game that there was going to be some twist that Simmons was still alive, but it never came. The narrators confirmed that they have an invisible weapon that's going to win this invisible war. We don't get very many choices when crafting our character, just their look, the interface color, and the difficulty. This is because Invisible War has removed the skill system from the game. No longer are we allowed to choose our abilities and truly craft our character. Skills and biomods were sort of merged into one system overall. I really don't love this change. It again feels like a regress. It feels like we're given less choice in favor of gaining a larger audience. We also don't play JC Denton in this entry. We play Alex D. Now, I'm just gonna spoil it here because I don't really think it's that big of a reveal, but Alex is actually Alex Denton. This was pretty obvious if you played the first game. Alex could actually be found in one of the Area 51 containers. The famous GameSpy interview, the Deus Ex Continuity Bible, even sees the journalist asking the developers who Alex Denton is, and they responded that they couldn't talk about it. Clearly, they had plans for using Alex in the sequel. I don't mind playing another character in this game. It's honestly not a bad choice overall, and lets us tell a new story with someone else. Alex grew up in Chicago, being trained at the Tarsus Academy. This is actually where we start our game, in the middle of a terrorist attack on the city. The game takes place 20 years after the events of Deus Ex in 2072. In the Tarsus facility, we have to be evacuated. Alex is part of a biomodification program with 2 other people, Billy Adams and Leo Jankowski. Something clearly fishy is going on, though, and the Order begins attacking the facility. We have to escape, and Adams tells us that she has information on the people behind Tarsus. Apparently, the subjects here were being monitored and experimented on, not trained. We see the ceiling disappear in our room, a false construction that was made specifically for monitoring subjects. We end up escaping the facility and are taken to Seattle. Before we get further into the story, we really should talk about the intricacies of combat in Invisible War. Like I said before, skills have been taken away. Augmentation and skills have been combined into the biomod system, which is really just the augmentation system from the previous games. Biomods are mostly activated powers that we have to turn on and off, just like augmentations. These mods are activated through their menu and they use bioenergy like before. There are different categories of biomods and we have choices of 3 in each of them. The only real problem with the biomod system is that upgrades for it are found almost immediately and are way too common. This is a huge problem with this game, the balance of items. We receive items either far too often or very little. We can upgrade all of our augments very quickly and then just see no progression after that. This is mostly because the biomod system is the only system of progression in the game. There's a GameSpy interview with Harvey Smith and Ricardo Bear about Invisible War. They mostly talked about the sequel, but when speaking about the difficulties with the original game, they had talked about balancing skills and reducing the amount of ranks that you could obtain. Eventually, they realized they needed to implement more progression to make winning more rewarding. This is when they introduced mods to weapons, little upgrades that you could achieve throughout the game. Mods are still included in Invisible War, but are far less common, so we're really left with biomods and weapon mods, 2 systems that don't really feel like much. The other problem with biomods is that there are some incredibly OP ones. Deus Ex Invisible War still approaches combat like the previous game, giving you the freedom to do what you'd like. We can stealth or attack head-on. The problem with this system, though, is that stealth just really isn't that viable. We can headshot enemies, but they don't die right away, so this inevitably reveals us to the opposing forces. The baton and other melee weapons also don't work like they used to, so no more sneaking up behind guards. The only real option for stealth in the game is using biomods. We can use the cloaking biomods, one for organics and one for synthetics, to just walk through any area undetected. This will literally get us past any situation. We can just walk past tons of enemies, and as long as we don't fire or run out of energy, we're good. The difference between the cloak in Invisible War and the one in Deus Ex was the first game made you choose between cloaking to organics or synthetics. Invisible War doesn't make you do this, so you can cloak yourself from everyone. I really don't like this new system in general. It feels pretty rough and like a huge step back from the first entry. Another massive change is the UI. Clearly, you can see that the UI is a lot different to the one in Deus Ex. The inventory screen has been heavily narrowed down. We have limited slots, clunky notes and quest menus, and the overall design just looks bad. This whole radial menu thing looks awful compared to the simple PC menus we had before. Though there is a reason for this. Obviously, the team was trying to gain the console market on the sequel, so they had to try and please both. Most of the time when I've seen this, though, it never really goes well, and you end up getting something that doesn't please anyone. The overall gameplay style of Invisible War is the same as Deus Ex. Each level generally sees us trying to infiltrate somewhere, stop an operation, kill or save someone. We have a choice of how to go about this, multiple angles of approach. The biggest difference here is with environment design. Most environments have been changed from large open areas that contain facilities and smaller corridors to just the corridor part. Each area is also split up into tons of smaller areas with longer loading screens in between them. This change was obviously made because the console version of the game couldn't support these massive, large, open environments. It does also feel like the proportions of items are just a bit off as well. Everything feels very large. We're almost like a child with showers and toilets looming above us. Most of the changes that Invisible War makes are for obvious reasons, because the team wanted to make a more profitable game and try something new, while also pushing their game onto consoles. A great idea in theory, but in execution, it seriously cuts some things that were integral to the game in the first place. This is all to say that I don't like these changes that were made, but I also don't think it makes Invisible War bad to play. It still functions pretty well, and the shooting is actually probably better than the first Deus Ex. We no longer have to wait for the reticle to focus in on a target, we can just shoot. For the most part, though, I think the gameplay is generally a regression, but the systems that made Deus Ex interesting in the first place are mostly still there. Once we get to Seattle, the game begins to split. We can choose between two paths here, heading to the Order or helping out the WTO. The Order are a New World religion that kind of has eaten all of the other religions of the world. They are led by Her Holiness, a mysterious figure that sees over the organization. You can't really tell what they're for or what they're about because everything they say is pretty vague and general. On the other side is the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. This is a trade syndicate run by Chad Dumier, the head of Silhouette from the first game. Both organizations are particularly shady and seem to have something going on. When you start, though, it kind of seems like the Order is fighting for some freedom from government. It's quite odd, though, that we don't seem to get as much information or context on the world in this entry. Maybe obscuring the past and context were part of an artistic choice to make the world more vague, but I'm not sure. The strange thing about the factions is also that we can switch which faction we're working with at any given point in the game. Each mission will have two objectives, for the most part, one from each side of the conflict. I get what they're doing here, in that they didn't want players to feel locked into one path, but it just feels strange to have the leaders of the factions contact us after every mission and scold us. They usually are angry that we didn't do what they wanted, but they still go, "But you know, if you still want to work with us, then you can, just don't do it again, okay?" And then we do it again, okay. In Seattle, we can get involved in some war between coffee shops, go to the Greasel Pit, bet on some lizard experiment fights, and get involved in all kinds of side missions and scraps. Through our investigations, we reveal that there is another secret group called the Templars, an organization full of modern-day soldiers that despise biomods. This group is who we're investigating, either for the WTO or the Order. One strength that Invisible War did have was it was constantly sending me off on side missions. Venturing through the city and talking to everyone we can will get us distracted pretty easily. We'll eventually have a list full of different things to check out. These aren't always the most interesting quests. Some of them can be pretty boring, but there were some highlights throughout the game. It did bring a sliver of that wonder that we came across in the previous entry. We have to go find a new weapon that the Templars are working on called the Mag Rail. To do this, we have to get a pilot. Getting to the next mission isn't as easy as it used to be in Deus Ex. We don't have a jock this time to help us out. We either have to save someone that will give us a free ride or pay a pilot that will take us to our next mission. One cool feature of this is your mission start point will be different based on the pilot you chose. One could be more covert and the other could put you right at the front door. This creates some variety in missions and approach, trying to mirror more of the original game and evolve that formula that it had. We invade the facility and we can actually find a gray alien in here already. I was weary of letting him out of his enclosure because I figured he'd just attack me like aliens in the previous game. I didn't expect him to actually come out and attack the scientists running the lab, but it makes sense. He was communicating to me through telepathy. It would make sense that he would attack the ones holding him captive, not the new face that was freeing him. Talking to the project director upstairs, he said that he thinks Mako, the company manufacturing the weapons, are supplying the Templars with hundreds of thousands of weapons. Once we kill the man who developed the Magrel or steal the plans, we can leave heading to Cairo. This is another major hub area for the game where we can get many different missions and objectives. It doesn't seem like there's as much to do here as Seattle though, but that was just my perception. The big deal in Cairo is dealing with Plague 11, the disease that's racking the city. We also encountered the Omar here. The Omar are pretty interesting. They are augmented humans that have had their frontal lobes replaced with a transmitter. Their culture and society surrounds itself with trying to push past the limitations of humanity. They also happen to have a huge black market trade. We can get some black market biomods from them that are harder to achieve than the other options. Turns out some corrupt individuals have been the ones perpetuating the plague in Cairo. We can also find Dr. Nassif here, who gives us some pretty important information. Nassif was the scientist who turned Alex into a lab project. We have the choice to kill her or not, but what she says before we do that is the important part. She tells Alex that he's a clone of J.C. Denton, which, if you were paying attention, you'd already know. Apostle Corps, the company that Nassif is a part of, has one more base in Trier, Germany. Tracer Tong is the one leading that cell. The only man left in the world that can contact J.C. Denton is him. When we head to Germany, we can immediately talk to Tracer, who tells us about a gateway nearby that we can use to get to JC's secret base in Antarctica. Unfortunately, the ruins nearby that house the portal have already been taken over by the Templars. When we get into the base that holds the portal we need, we find Nicolette Duclair, who also drops some truth bombs on us. Apparently, the Illuminati is still around, still ruling from behind the scenes. They are behind both the Order and the WTO, creating the groups so that they could get people warring. Once the organizations started fighting, it became easier to control people from the shadows. We have to get an activation key for the portal before we begin to head out. It's located in a nearby Templar stronghold. Once we retrieve this, we make a portal to Antarctica and head out to find JC. When we get to Antarctica, there are a ton of Greys just standing around. One of them talks to Alex to tell him that apparently there are multiple keys that will unlock JC from his slumber. The Greys have been protecting JC while he rests because they're friends or something. So, Invisible War's story is actually a little bonkers. The beginning half just doesn't really feel like it does anything new. It's a similar character arc. Someone who doesn't understand the world is having the veil being pulled away, and they begin to realize that things are much deeper than they thought. This worked really well in the first game, but it begins to feel like we're retreading old ground here. Once we get towards the end, they start introducing interesting elements, but all of these interesting elements are really just callbacks to the previous game. Tracer Tong, Nicolette Duclair, J.C. Denton, all of this stuff just feels more like fan service than anything else. I do think some of the stuff, like the aliens, are cool, but they're certainly not good storytelling. We eventually find JC, who is conscious but trapped. We have to fix the Helios processing modules. Each of these brings us back into one of JC's memories, which lets us see some environments from the previous game, but in the new engine. I think the sequence is actually pretty cool. There's some interesting concepts here and a short, visually appealing little sequence. We eventually get JC out of this trapped mode. We should also probably talk about the ending to Deus Ex really quickly. So obviously that game had 3 different endings to choose from. With that choice being made at the end of the game, fans were sort of left to choose their own canon when they beat Deus Ex. This is all thrown out the window when the sequel released, because Invisible War canonizes every ending. The collapse happened, which was part of Tracer Tong's ending, pushing humanity into a new dark age. The Illuminati was still in power, which was part of Morgan Everett's ending to make them the new rulers, and JC is still merged with the Helios AI. This was a really odd choice, but one that I actually kind of like. It's a weird subversion and almost a bit of a troll. It's not the best option you could have picked. The best option would be to make a prequel or make a sequel so far off that the ending to the previous game didn't really matter, but it's still kind of interesting because not a lot of games choose to wrap all of the endings into one. JC and Paul's ultimate goal is to create a new civilization. They want to unify humanity into one being using the Helios AI to bring them together. JC will give us his spiel and we leave Antarctica. Before we head to Liberty Island to choose our ending for this game, we have to head back to Cairo. We have to infiltrate the city and either save or kill Paul Denton, who is being held in one of the flight bays. Our last mission takes place on Liberty Island itself, back where we started the first game. This is where we decide our ending. If we give JC and Paul the Aquinas protocol and use their machine, then Alex's nanites are distributed to everyone on the planet. The AI is in complete control and humanity is united. We can kill Paul and JC and give the Illuminati the Aquinas protocol. This will allow the Illuminati to control the world once again. We can give the Templars the Aquinas protocol and kill JC and Paul, which purges humanity of nanites entirely. All modified humans are destroyed, giving the Templars their ideal world. The last ending only occurs if we kill all of the leaders at Liberty Island. This results in Earth turning into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The Omar are the only ones to survive and take the planet for themselves. These endings are fine, but again, they exhibit the same problems as the story itself. They're just retreads of the endings we had before. The whole game really just feels like an expansion of the last game, but slightly worse. I can't really say I enjoyed Deus Ex Invisible War. I think that in a vacuum, I would have liked this game. I don't think it's a bad game, but I think it got a raw deal of having to follow one of the greatest games of all time. It was given a burden, because looking at Invisible War and directly comparing it to Deus Ex makes it look really rough in comparison. But when you look at it alone, it really isn't that bad. I think that if Invisible War had come out first and Deus Ex had been released after, then they would have both been impressive. But we can't view the game in a vacuum. Not truly, because it's still a sequel, and we have to compare it to the previous entry at least a little bit. In that regard, it's a downgrade in most ways. The team really treats this as them trying to appeal to more people to make the game more successful, but I think in doing so, they lost a lot of what made the original game great in the first place. Their rationale makes sense. Who wouldn't want to make money with their game? Spectre even states this in one of the interviews that he did. What we want is as many people as humanly possible to experience the kind of gameplay we provide. I mean, anyone who says, yeah, I want a smaller audience, I don't want a lot of people to see my work, go back to Greenwich Village and put on a beret and whatever. But I think there's a line to ride here. Get your game to as many people as you can while still giving your fans what they liked in the first place. I think that's the largest thing the sequel loses, is one of the things that I praised the first game for. Its soul. That indescribable thing that I tried to put into words when I talked about Deus Ex. It just really wasn't here for Invisible War. It felt like at certain points it would poke through, like I could feel it in the next room. But for the most part, that aesthetic, that feeling, that energy was gone. This feeling was incredibly important to the appeal of Deus Ex, at least for me. When the game feels pretty hollow, then there isn't a lot of intrigue there. Now, that doesn't mean that Deus Ex games have to keep the same style to be good, but when that aesthetic is gone and, on top of that, most of the gameplay and story have been downgraded, it just feels weird. And I'm honestly not claiming that Invisible War is some terrible, awful cash grab. I genuinely don't think that's the case. It seems like the team wanted to make a really good game, something that people would care about. But this is just one of those cases where it went wrong. That happens with games, and it's not pleasing to see when it does occur. Invisible War sold pretty well on release, regardless. It was described as having a respectable debut. By 2011, the game had actually sold more copies than the original. Critics generally liked Invisible War, but it didn't receive the praise that the first entry did. Most publications said that it was an original experience and a brilliant RPG. Some elements were criticized, though, like the biomod system. Another game in the series would come along, but it wouldn't arrive for another 8 years. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.